Micah 6 verse 8 says, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Tonight, we are going to conclude our study of the book of Esther. And as I promised this morning, I have arranged for a very special guest to join us later. I wonder who that's going to be. You'll find out soon enough. But first, we need to jump right back in where we left off earlier today at the start of Esther chapter 8. Now, as we came to the end of chapter 7, the tables had been turned. Esther is queen, Haman is dead. King Ahasuerus is still the king, but his leadership style, or lack of leadership style, doesn't change. And the Jews are still left with a major problem. Haman's decree to eradicate them, an unalterable decree signed by the king, was still in effect. So many innocent people are going to be slaughtered because of the evil actions of a now dead man. That's where we pick back up, Esther chapter 8. Begin reading at verse 1. On that day, that's the day that the king heard of Haman's plans and ordered him to be killed. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told him who he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again with the king. She fell at his feet and wept, and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if things seem right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people, or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So the ironic reversals of the story continue. Haman, who had hoped to plunder the Jews' property, now had his own property confiscated and given to, of all people, Esther. And she in turn gives it to Mordecai to oversee it. The king's signet ring, which had been given to Haman, was now given to Mordecai, and Mordecai now has the power that Haman previously had. Now, since the decree to exterminate the Jews was still in effect, something had to be done. So Esther appeared before the king a second time, begging him to put an end to Haman's evil plan. Once again, she did this without an invitation, which meant she was risking her own death in doing so. But the king was favorable toward her and once again held out the golden scepter to her. And Esther's request was simple. She wanted a second decree written and sent out that would override the first decree. The king made note that Esther and Mordecai now had the power and resources that previously belonged to Haman, so they should use that power to their advantage and issue their own decree. Ahasuerus even gave Mordecai the authority to write the decree any way he wished and to stamp it with the king's authority by using the king's signet ring. The decree that Mordecai wrote was sent out in the 3rd month of the year. And this was a little over 2 months after Haman's decree, so the Jews had about 9 months to prepare themselves for the conflict. Mordecai's decree was sent out in the exact same way that Haman's decree was sent. And verse 11 tells us what the decree said. The king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. And now as we move to verse 15, Mordecai becomes the honorable hero of the story. Reading at verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, chapter 9 fast forwards 9 months to the day Haman had planned to kill the Jewish people. And it contains some pretty gruesome statistics. Reading at verse 5, it says, "The Jews struck all of their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. It did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men." Verses 7 through 10 tell us that they also killed the 10 sons of Haman, but they laid no hand on the plunder. And now continuing at verse 11, we are told, "That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, 'In Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled.' And Esther said, 'If it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows.'" Now, if you're paying attention to small details, you may wonder why Esther wanted to impale the already dead bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Well, that, according to people who study these kind of things, says that this was a pretty common practice for the time. Doing that was a visual warning that others had better not try to commit the same crime. So Esther asked for the king's permission to do this, and she also asked for permission to extend the decree for a second day. Reading at verse 14. "So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and got relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder." Now here again, if you're paying attention to small details, 75,810 men were killed by the Jews. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And once the fighting is over, in typical fashion of the story, there's another banquet. Previously, when Haman issued his decree, the city of Susa had been thrown into confusion. But now, following the decree of Mordecai, the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. This change of events also caused many people to convert to Judaism. The people of Persia were beginning to see that it was not fate and chance that governed their life. Instead, the God of the universe was in control. Mordecai wrote a proclamation that the Jews were to celebrate this event annually. And Esther wrote her own letter confirming her uncle's instructions. And this annual Jewish celebration is called the Purim. It gets its names from Haman's use of the pur, the casting of lots, to determine the time of the execution. And the pur became a symbol of God using our daily circumstances for his purpose. We come to chapter 10. It's entitled The Greatness of Mordecai. And that book closes with 3 verses that speak of King Ahasuerus' power. But more importantly, the closing verse of the book says this in verse 3. "Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. That's the end of the story. So let's take a few moments now to look at 5 big picture lessons we can learn from it. First, the book of Esther is about God's ongoing protection of his covenant people. Her story is similar to the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Both of these stories involve foreign monarchs who control the destiny of the Jewish people. Both accounts show the heroism of Israelite individuals who provided the means for the salvation of their people and nation. It also reminds us of the story of the Exodus as the Israelites were rescued from slavery in Egypt. God is the sovereign ruler of the universe, and we can be assured that his plans will not be moved or changed by the actions of evil people. The book of Esther also shows us the difference between seeing the hand of God in our circumstances or seeing things as merely coincidence. Interestingly enough, God's name is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther, not even once. But the string of coincidences that lead to the deliverance of God's people are so striking that God's work in the story is obvious. For example, King Ahasuerus' timely insomnia, or Haman showing up right after the king decided to honor Mordecai. Another interesting fact, there is no mention of Mordecai or Esther or the Jewish people praying in this book either. But Esther's command for a 3-day fast would certainly have included prayers for guidance as part of that. Second lesson, we need to talk for a moment about the moral tone, or what we call the ethics of this story, for a minute. Some scholars, both Jewish and Christian scholars, have been critical of the details we're provided. Esther has been indicted for hiding her Jewish identity, for her willingness to marry a Gentile, for not showing mercy to Haman, and for asking the king to permit the slaughter of the Jews' enemies. Mordecai has been accused of things like pride, for using Esther for his own advancement, and for rejoicing over fallen enemies. The massacre of the Jews' enemies has also been deemed as being as wicked as the original plot against them. But the book of Esther was not really written to be a lesson on ethics. Instead, it underlines the persecution experienced by the Jews. It teaches us that God remains committed to preserving his covenant people. And it reminds us that God's Old Testament and New Testament people have all too often fallen short of his standards. And before we get too judgmental here, we have to remember that we, that's you and me, do the same thing today. Now, despite the criticism, the actions of the Jews were actually morally superior. Haman's original decree called for the extermination of men, women, and children. And it also allowed and permitted them to take plunder. The Jewish defensive forces killed only the men. And these men were not killed for simply being Persian. They were known enemies who were threatening the Jews. So these were defensive tactics, not offensive acts. And we are told 3 times that they did not take plunder. The people who planned to attack the Jews may have seen this as an opportunity to get rich at someone else's expense. But the Jews weren't doing it for money, only in self-defense. Third lesson. Esther's story challenges us to look at God's timing of things and not our own. Now, we may not understand what God is doing now, but a time will come when we will realize why it is we've gone through certain experiences or met certain people, or lived in certain areas, or even shopped in certain stores, or taken certain trips. One day, we too will look back and see that we were put in that moment of time just like Esther was. She was put into a harem for such a time as this. She was given to a king for such a time as this. She was strengthened and prepared to intercede for her people for such a time as this. Esther is a reminder of God's promise that's found in Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. God is always at work in the lives of his people. The coincidences that define our lives are not simply products of cause and effect or of random chance. They are moments that God intends to be used for the advancement of his kingdom. There's a definition that I really like. It came across a while back. It says, coincidences are those moments when God chooses to remain silent. The question is, are we paying attention? Lesson 4. In Esther, we're given a behind-the-scenes look at the ongoing struggle between God and Satan. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read the last book, God wins. The entrance of Christ into the human race was predicated upon the existence of the Jewish race. Haman's plan to kill the Jews was nothing less than Satan's attempt to kill Jesus' family tree. But just as Haman was defeated on the gallows he built for Mordecai, the devil was defeated by the cross he erected to destroy Jesus. The ironic reversals of Esther, the powerful being humiliated, and the powerless being vindicated and restored, point us towards the ironic reversals that Jesus spoke of in his Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And our final lesson, recalling the words of Micah 6, verse 8, Esther challenges us to consider how justice is administered in our world today. Now, we know that the world is made up of the powerful and the powerless. And we know that life lived under the powers of others is risky. We know from history that people of a different race or religion can find themselves facing death based on the whim of those in authority. And Esther shows us that help can come from the most unexpected of places and in the most surprising ways. A beauty queen is not the most obvious of saviors. And throwing a dinner party seemed like an unlikely strategy for survival. But in the end, her plan worked. It worked because real power comes from naming the enemy. That is one of the truths of the story and a key to understanding what it means to do justice. There are Hamans in our world today who want to be bowed down to. They are everywhere. They come in all kinds of different forms. They are political leaders, a corrupt corporation, an unethical supervisor, even school bullies. As followers of Jesus Christ, should we be naming these enemies? We are called We are called to implement a vision that is greater than our own. And here's how the prophet Isaiah summarizes this vision. I'm reading now from Isaiah 65, beginning at verse 17. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy and her people to be a gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall it be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. And these next 3 verses are key to this vision. No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the young man shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. This vision of Isaiah calls for basic social conditions and needs to be met, for children to be protected, for elderly people to be respected, and for men and women to be given a fair return for their labor. But this is not just a vision of our future hope. The kingdom of God is already here. However, it's not yet complete. So our calling as followers of Jesus Christ is to work to bring it into reality. Who knows? Maybe you were made for such a time as we are in right now. Comedian and talk show host Stephen Colbert was born in Washington, D.C. and raised in South Carolina. He was one of 11 children. He was raised Catholic and attended Episcopalian schools. He's known for using humorous fallacies of logic to explain his views on a variety of topics, including irreverent and sometimes provocative examinations of religious topics like this one. He said, if this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we've got to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then admit that we just don't want to do it. Your involvement in Isaiah's vision means engaging it where you already are, in your home, with your extended family, in your neighborhood, in the marketplace, at school, at work, with your sports teams, and in your social clubs, and yes, here in this church too. We must never forget that the church is a missional organization. The church does not exist to serve us. We exist to serve the church. We are ordinary people called to do extraordinary things with God. We are where God placed us for such a time as this. We are here like Mordecai to work for the good and the peace of all people. Friends, this is your time to make a difference. I said that I arranged for a very special guest to be with us this evening. Her name is Queen Esther. Now, I was going to bring her here in person, but then I found out what it would cost to fly her here from the Middle East, and that just wasn't in the budget. But I did find a way to get her here instead, live on tape. So let's listen to what she has to say about her story and her challenge for us. And when she's done, both her and I will close in prayer. Go ahead, Amber.
And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this.
Time waits for no one. It has a startling way of reminding us that we are a moment and that God is forever. My story is about time and how God, in his sovereignty, allowed me to see his kingdom come. My name is Esther, and I know what it is like to lack vision and to have grasped it. Growing up, I had no mother or father, but was under the care of my dear cousin Mordecai. And while there were times that I couldn't see any great plans for my future, God most certainly did. I lived through a time of tremendous turmoil, where extermination breathed heavy down my neck and knocked hard at my people's door. You see, there's been a long history of killing men and women simply because they believe in the living God. As if killing people who worship God gets rid of God himself. An unthinkable plot to annihilate all the Jewish people hung heavy over the palace like a thick, dark cloud. As I recalled God's faithfulness to me, I realized that my purpose must be his purpose, that my time is his time, and that forever my heart must be at his service. I needed him and him alone to reveal the battle plan, and if I perished, I perished. I knew I was here for such a time as this. Unusual times call for unusual action. And so I called for 3 days of prayer and fasting throughout the entire kingdom. And I fell prostrate before the Lord. And I heard the words of God. And I received a vision from the Almighty. I then proceeded to invite the king twice to dinner. And I told him of the evil plot to destroy all the Jewish people. My people. And again, I found the Lord most true to his word, that everything that is hidden in darkness will be brought into the light, and the motives of men's hearts will be made known. His Majesty responded most favorably, and the Jewish people once again beheld a miraculous deliverance. I suppose I could have argued back and forth with God, telling him all the reasons why I wasn't qualified to be in this position at this particular time, and thus accomplished nothing. But I learned this, that while we may not understand why God has placed us where he has, that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a plan. For God knows the plans he has for us, and they are good plans. Plans to prosper us and not to harm us. Plans to give us hope and a future. A calendar may tell the day, but it doesn't have the power to understand time. God is calling you, as he did to me, to understand the times that you are living in against the blueprint of eternity. For we are a vapor. God is eternal. We are here today and gone tomorrow. Will you use your position for His heavenly purpose. Teach us, O God, to number our days aright, so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. May the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us and establish the work of our hands. Yes, establish the work of our hands.
Lord Jesus Christ, there was a short time when you lived among us here on earth. But for now, your physical presence can only be seen in us. You currently have no hands or feet to do your work here on earth but ours. You currently have no voice to spread your message here but ours. Give us the courage to stand our ground and to fight injustice. Give us the strength to be willing to name the enemies and call for them to be held accountable. Work in us and work through us to make a difference, knowing that whatever we do for the least of those among us, we have done for you. Amen.
Friends, would you rise if you're able?
Jesus, I surrender all to Him. I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him. In His presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender. To Thee, my blessed Savior, I surrender all to Jesus, I surrender. Make me Savior, only Thine. Let me feel Thy Holy Spirit. Jesus, I